Contracts in Formula 1 are complex and opaque. We might see that a driver is on, 30 million a year, but is that before tax, after tax, including bonuses, excluding bonuses? Does it include image rights? Does it include, well, whatever? And speaking of image rights and contracts, back in the late 90s, Ron Dennis tried to buy the rights to Mika Hakkinen and David Coulthard's helmet designs for a cool $1 million apiece, and was moderately surprised when they told him to do one. Because the helmet is a driver's personal thing, and in a way the art of helmet design has disappeared in recent years, and I blame Vettel for that. Aside from Hamilton's, Lando's and Alonso's, there's not that many helmets that you look at with all the stickers taken off and go, that's definitely Gasly's, that's definitely Behrman's, or whichever driver it is. Then there's the story of Jacques Villeneuve, who famously in the 90s wouldn't allow his name to be used in the official Formula 1 games. Either because he wasn't yet a member of the GPDA, or because he was still tied to kart, or he was straight up saying no because he could. It's not really clear. But either way, many of us who were around at the time will either know him as Driver 1 Williams, Williams number 1, or the GOAT himself, John Newhouse. And yes, I know it should be Jack Newtown or Jack Newton because that's a like-for-like French to English translation, but I think Microprose went with John Newhouse because it's less obvious. This was the picture they used for him in Grand Prix Manager 2. I'm doing a bit of extra digging to try and get closure on the whole situation because it's something I've been wondering about for, well, nearly 30 years. Villeneuve still owned his likeness and name because he hadn't signed them over to FOCA yet. I'm guessing that they just got a guy who worked at Microprose to just fill in as a facial model. The picture in Grand Prix 3, also by Microprose and still used John Newhouse, was a different face model. Sometimes when I mention Jacques Villeneuve, I do call him John Newhouse as a nod back to those Microprose games, and some people don't quite get the reference. It's one of those if you know types of things, so since we're talking about contracts, I thought I'd pop that one in. But we always know things as being you have two drivers, and then you might have a reserve driver. Sometimes there are or were two, depending on which piece of F1 history you're looking at. Because back in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, it was quite feasible that you could make a career for yourself as a test driver, even if it did hold you back a bit. At some point you would have to try and get out, because that's all you'll be seen as being, and the longer you're out, the less race ready you're going to be. Now if you're Pedro de la Rosa or Alex Wurz, and I probably should do a video on Wurz at some point, you have some talent to call on when you get to drive again, or if you get to drive again. But if you're Luca Badoa, well, we saw how that turned out, didn't we? And it was in the news recently, because Alpine signed Franco Colapinto to their ranks, and just recently they signed a fourth reserve driver, which Autosport said is almost a mirror of Flavio Briatore's Renault back in the day. That was a time when Renault had Alonso, Webber, Button, Kovalainen, Kubica, Montero and other drivers on their books, because Flavio managed most of them. And now, because of Franco being at Alpine, there's rumours that Doohan is walking a tightrope thinner than a spiderweb strand, simply because of the commercial opportunities that Franco brings with him. And it is unheard of these days, since teams will typically have the two main drivers, a test and reserve driver, and then maybe the academy driver on the books if they have one. Sometimes the reserve and academy driver can be the same guy. And in 2015, one of the teams on the Formula 1 grid signed some drivers, but they might have signed too many. In 1998, Monisha Kaltenborn, a trained lawyer who once worked for the United Nations, started working for the Fritz Kaiser Group. At the time, Fritz Kaiser was one of a group of people involved with owning the Sauber Formula 1 team, which was a three-way split between founder Peter Sauber, the recently departed Red Bull owner Dietrich Mateschitz, and the Fritz Kaiser Group. This being at a time where the Sauber Formula 1 cars had Red Bull and Petronas on the cars, which might confuse some DTS fans. And Sauber was a team that often managed to punch a little bit above its weight from time to time. They had a technical partnership with Ferrari, which is not unlike how Haas does things today, and that helped them to save money. In the late 90s, after a time with Ford, they were running Ferrari engines badged as Petronas in reference to one of their main sponsors. Peter usually found a way of existing, even if everything around them was starting to crumble. And having that partnership with Ferrari, the dominant team of the early 2000s, was probably a good thing, because as Minardi and Jordan fell to pieces over the course of the first 5 years of the 2000s, Sauber continued to function and be moderately competitive, even if they lacked the funds of the manufacturers. Probably because they were, for want of a better description, Ferrari clones, which did get them into trouble at one point. In 2000, Kaiser sold its shares and Kaltenborn remained at the team as the Sauber corporate and legal affairs boss. Over the next few years, she continued to work with the team, staying with Sauber as Red Bull pulled its involvement, and then as BMW became the overall owners of the team. I did see something on the internet just now of how Red Bull was initially going to buy the Sauber team instead of buying Jaguar as they did in the what you would call the Prime universe, but they didn't because of a dispute involving their driver, Enrique Bernaldi. Red Bull wanted to put their guy in the car for 2001, but instead Peter had taken a punt on some Finnish kid called Raikkonen. So Bernaldi took his Red Bull money over to Arrows, and that was that. But it wouldn't be the first time that Sauber would be in a contract dispute with a driver. I mean, I mentioned that less than a minute ago, so we'll just continue, shall we? In 2011, the BMW branding was all gone from the Saubers as BMW pulled the plug in the wake of the economic recession, but they remained as BMW Sauber in 2010 because of the Concorde Agreement. In doing so, Sauber, which was now back in Peter's hands, was going to have to survive on its own through getting backing in any way possible, and was offered a lifeline when they took on Sergio Perez, who brought with him some substantial backing through being associated with Carlos Slim, who was, for a time, the richest man in the world. At the same time, Kaltenborn had become the CEO of Sauber Motorsport AG. Sauber managed to persist, having Checo's money backing them and then getting in other drivers, Kamui Kobayashi and De La Rosa in 2011, but then having Kamui for the full season in 2012, a season where Checo almost won Sauber's first race in 4 years. I mean, sort of, when Checo finished second at the Malaysian Grand Prix. I say sort of because in 2008 when Kubica won, they were BMW Sauber. But as a great man once said, it's best not to dwell on such minutiae. 2012 might be one of the best seasons that Sauber had, as Sauber rather than BMW Sauber, and it raised Checo's stock substantially, and it wouldn't be the first time he caught the attention of a big team. Because in 2013, Checo would be off to McLaren to join Jenson Button as Hamilton made his shock move to Mercedes. In turn, Sauber had an all-new lineup as they brought in Nico Hülkenberg from Force India and hired rookie Esteban Gutierrez, who had similar backing to Checo. And when you need the money, you take what you can get. And Sauber's points return in 2013 wasn't as good as it was in 2012, with them finishing on 57 points in 2013 versus 126 in 2012, but had only dropped one position in the standings. 2014, on the other hand, that was a shower. Sauber scored 0 points in 2014, which I think might be the worst season they've ever had. It actually is the worst season they've ever had. It's the only time in the team's 32 or 33 year history that they failed to score, and it was down to a number of reasons, chief among which being that the car was overweight, which didn't help things because Adrian Sutil, who had replaced Hülkenberg for the year, was heavier than the vast majority of the field. And weight is something that Mark Webber struggled with in his later career because he was taller than most of the grid and therefore heavier, and in the last couple of years of his Formula 1 career, he looked ill. As such, the C33 is to date the least competitive car in Sauber's history. Sutil was able to get 11th a couple of times and just miss out on points, but that was about it. Gutierrez, meanwhile, was unfortunate to be on the end of a Pastor Maldonado dive bomb at Bahrain that flipped his car over, and later on in the season, Sutil would aquaplane off the road in torrential conditions at Suzuka, and as his car was being recovered, Jules Bianchi left the road and struck the recovery vehicle. So with no points scored and very little, if anything, to come in the way of Constructors' prize money in 2014, Sauber had to do something drastic. At the end of the season, Gutierrez took up a role over at Ferrari, while in the November of 2014, Sauber announced that Sutil would be leaving the team as well. And this is where the problems began. Sauber announced at some point in 2014 that they'd signed Marcus Ericsson from Caterham and also signed Williams reserve driver Felipe Nasr as the replacements for Gutierrez and Sutil. But Sutil was convinced that he had a contract for 2015, which the BBC reported on at the time. Andrew Benson's article being much more factual than it was this morning, because this morning when he was writing about practice in Melbourne, he said that Russell was still driving for Williams. But either way, Sutil was rather hacked off, saying that Sauber now had 3 first-team drivers, and the other 2 drivers had signed contracts after he did, so he should be first in line for a seat. But Sauber was doing what was necessary for survival. Nasr was bringing in big money from his primary sponsor, Banco do Brasil, and Ericsson also had his backers. So if Nasr and Ericsson had the logos of their backers plastered all over the cars, Sauber would be up to the tune of £20 million, which would be a significant amount, and would offer somewhat of a lifeline. Remember that Caterham had missed a few races towards the end of 2014 and then went under after the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, while Marussia was under new ownership and rebranded Manor. But wait, there's more. Sauber's test driver in 2014 was Guido van der Garde, although given some of the stuff he's been tweeting, he could be more Guido Bantergarde. Either way, van der Garde had been on track 7 times in 2014, doing free practice runs. But just before the season started in 2015, reports surfaced that van der Garde was claiming that he also had a contract for 2015. So for 2 seats in that season, Sauber had somehow signed 2 drivers for each of those 2 seats. Like Sutil, Guido was let go despite supposedly having this contract for a race seat, only to see his and Adrian's seats, in inverted commas, go to Nasser and Ericsson instead. So Guido took his case to the Swiss Chambers Arbitration Institution in the December of 2014, so about 4 months or so before his case went public. Sauber meanwhile claimed that Sutil was in breach of contract, because apparently there were clauses in place that said he had to go out and find backers, which he allegedly hadn't, so they could use that clause to break the second year of the deal off, if they wanted to. As the Formula 1 teams arrived in Brazil towards the end of 2014, this had become the hot topic, with the general vibe amongst the media being, how can you sign 3 drivers to 2 seats? And with the van der Garde stuff coming at the beginning of 2015, that was going to cause chaos, because the season was literally about to start. Speaking of, in the March of 2015, court orders from Switzerland meant that van der Garde should be allowed to race in Melbourne at the start of the 2015 Formula 1 season, despite it being Nasser and Ericsson on the entry list. Sauber responded by saying that this was going to be difficult because of the cars being built to fit Nasser and Ericsson, and the lawyers of the drivers got in on the act as well. Sauber also told the Swiss courts that van der Garde's contract had been terminated with approval from the FIA's Contract Recognition Board, the same board that Jenson Button found himself in front of a couple of times with regards to his Williams and BAR contracts. So in return, van der Garde filed a complaint with the courts in Victoria, where Melbourne is down in Australia, to essentially sue Sauber for contempt of court. In response to that, Sauber didn't take part in the first practice session. By this point, Sutil was about to start work at Williams as their test driver, and like van der Garde was still trying to get some answers over what was what, although his dispute with Sauber was a little more on the quiet side. On the 14th of March 2015, which was the Saturday of that Australian Grand Prix weekend, van der Garde said he wouldn't race in Melbourne as he and Sauber looked to a more permanent solution for 2016 and beyond, which allowed Nasser and Ericsson to get out on track for the third practice session and then go into qualifying, before ultimately taking part in the race on Sunday. And then on the 28th of March 2015, van der Garde had reached a settlement with Sauber for $16 million as they terminated that 2015 contract. Considering that Ericsson and Nasser were supposed to be bringing a combined $20 million, that payout must have stung. But Sutil's case went on a lot longer. Reports came out again in the January of 2016 on espn.co.uk that Sutil had gone to the Supreme Court of Zurich in Switzerland to see about obtaining around £2.4 million in compensation for the 2014 season, with a separate claim for the lack of racing he did in 2015. Sauber reiterated the claim that Sutil was contractually obliged to get around $40 million in sponsorship and hadn't done so, which allowed them to terminate the contract on their end. Eventually, a settlement was reached, but I can't find any details. The most recent reports I can find were from 2016 about suing for that $2.4 million, and then you got the reports from 2015 as van der Garde was paid his $15-16 million depending on the currency involved. So was it worth it? Well, for 2015 it was, because Sauber ended up finishing in 8th place in the Constructors, ahead of McLaren who had their first year back with Honda. And any hope of those new Honda years being like the old Senna years evaporated almost immediately. And Sauber finished ahead of Manor, who predictably finished on 0 points. 36 points were scored for Sauber that year, which was quite the bounce back after 2014, and also pretty good considering the legal minefields they found themselves in. 15 million quid. Imagine how much they could have improved the car with that money instead of buying off contracts. The hilarious part is, Kaltenborn had spoken to the media and insisted she knew what she was doing. But 2016 was diabolical by comparison, and almost back to the dark days of 2014. With 2 races left in the season, Sauber looked on course to score no points again, and were going to be royally embarrassed by Manor if they did so, because Manor had scored just 1 point at the Austrian Grand Prix of that year. The lawsuits that had been paid out had hurt the development on the new car and then upgrading that new car through that 2016 season, and it was a mighty long slog to catch up. To be outscored by a team in a worse position was not going to be a good look, and the best the team could get was 11th, which Ericsson achieved on multiple occasions. But it was NASA that saved the team from embarrassment, taking 9th place at his home Grand Prix in Brazil, and that elevated Sauber above Manor by just 1 single point, and in effect condemned Manor to bankruptcy as they folded at the end of that season, being the last of the 3 2010 teams to do so. Sauber had held on, but it was not a pretty sight. But Sauber managed to get some sort of rescue as they fought to recover from what is frankly an embarrassing time. Longbow Finance had bought into the team during 2016 and that gave them some much needed boosts financially, and just days before the 2017 Azerbaijan Grand Prix, Sauber announced that Kaltenborn would be leaving her post as the first ever female team principal, to be replaced by Frederick Vasseur, who has since moved on to Ferrari. The statement at the time read, "Longbow Finance SA regrets to announce that, by mutual consent and due to diverging views of the future of the company, Manisha Kaltenborn will leave her positions with the Sauber Group effective immediately. We thank her for her many years of strong leadership, great passion for the Sauber F1 team, and wish her the very best for the future. Her successor will be announced shortly. In the meantime, we wish the team the best of luck in Azerbaijan." So what happened to the other drivers then? Well, Van der Garde went into sports cars, primarily racing LMP2s, and won the 2016 European Le Mans Series. He carried on racing in sports cars until 2023 when he retired and is now a pundit for Viaplay, basically talking about Max Verstappen for a living. And he was doing that since about 2015 when Max first came in, just to sort of offer insight on how he's getting on and how his career is progressing and all of that stuff. Sutil, meanwhile, has been a little quieter, as there is a massive gap between him racing in Formula 1 and then picking something else up. His 2 most recent seasons in racing have been in the Ferrari Challenge Europe Series, finishing 5th in 2022 and 6th in 2023, although it looks like he didn't do the full season in both of those years. Since then, he's amassed quite the collection of rare and exotic cars. He's got or has had several Koenigsegg's, including the CCXR, Agera S, Jesko Absolute and the Regera. He's also had the Ferrari 488 Pista, Ferrari Enzo, Ferrari the Ferrari, several Veyrons, 2 Chirons, a Mercedes SLR Stirling Moss, a McLaren Senna LM that he crashed, a Pagani Zonda, and the Pagani Hurrah. Kaltenborn remained in racing briefly after leaving Sauber, setting up KDC Racing. She and her business partner, Emily de Comberti, named the team by combining their initials, and they set out on their new racing adventure. Unfortunately, the team was only active for a single year, the 2018 racing season, as they had 2 operations in the ADAC F4 and Italian F4 championships. In both championships, the cars were uncompetitive, with not a single win, pole or fastest lap to their name, and they fizzled out as the debts piled up, with the team set up to some press attention because the 2 people at the top of the team were females, and they were looking to expand into having young female races driving for them. But it just was not to be. Out of the 4 drivers they had on their books that year, Toby Sowery is the one who got the furthest in a racing career, with him doing 2 races for Dale Coyne Racing in IndyCar last season, and he was in the Daytona 24 this year for CrowdStrike Racing. But the whole Sauber thing was just crazy. The closest thing we've had to it since was the Oscar Piastri situation at Alpine that I covered at the time. And all of that was kind of kick-started by Vettel's retirement announcement, because immediately after Vettel announced his retirement, Alonso announced that he was going to Aston, and then that left Alpine twiddling their thumbs for a bit. But really, Oscar seems to have got the best deal compared to Sutil or Van der Garde. He's now racing for the Constructors' Champions. But at the same time, 15 million, although that number is going to go up and down depending on which currency is being used. It's amazing how Sauber stayed alive afterwards given how cash-strapped they already were. But they are still in Formula 1. Well, at least until the end of the year anyway, and then they're going to become Audi. Just another chapter in Sauber's 33 or 34 year history, really. So then, a look at the baffling time Sauber hired 4 drivers for 2 seats, and ending up having to pay out bigly for the trouble. If this has been a fun look down memory lane, you can like the video to show me that I did a good job, and if you want to see more from this channel, there's a subscribe button that you can click and a bell that you can ring, apparently, so you know that there's going to be more stuff from the channel. But I think YouTube's playing up again. It's not telling people that I'm putting videos up when they're, ringing the bell, but either way, massive thanks as ever to the mad lads at Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help keep the lights on or contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, there's a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup or otherwise do a one and done donation, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye. And now the people across the road can start shredding that Christmas tree again.